Everyone, thank you for joining us today. So you are at the webinar for the NIH Instrumentation Grant Program for Resource Limited Institutions. So the webinar recording and slides will be made available. We'll post a notice at the link that I've shared in the chat, and we encourage you to ask questions via chat throughout the presentation, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm Desiree Salazar. I'm currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator for Extramural Programs at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And today's presenters are working on behalf of a team who's worked on creating this initiative. So our presenters today are Dr. Dorothy Beckett, who's the director at the Division of Biophysics, Biomedical Technology, and Computational Biosciences at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. Dr. Anthony DeBello, who's program director from the Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities at the Diversity Training Branch at the National Cancer Institute. And Dr. Xiangning Li, who's director of the Division of Construction and Instruments at the Office of Research Infrastructure Programs in the Division of Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives in the Office of the Director at the National Institutes of Health. So thank you very much. And again, the recording and slides will be made available, and please enter your questions throughout the Q&A. And I ask everybody who's joined to stay muted and off camera until the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. Dr. Dorothy Beckett will get us started.
Okay, just a sec. I will try to find my camera. Let's see. There it goes. Sorry. Okay, so thanks for attending, and I'm going to start with an overview of the background and the overview of the RLI S10 program. So the program is actually part of a much larger initiative at the NIH. It's the UNITE initiative, which has three components. One is to address health disparities and minority health research. The second is to address issues with the internal NIH workforce. And the third is to focus on external biomedical and behavioral research workforce. And the goals of the UNITE initiative are to enable greater transparency, accountability, and communications across the NIH and the external biomedical and behavioral research community. Within this overall initiative is the addressing the external workforce, and that is the UNITE committee, and it is committed to changing policy, culture, and structure to promote diversity in the extramural research ecosystem. So the UNITE priorities, we have multiple priorities. One, three of which have already been at some level accomplished, but not completed. One is to expand the Program for Science Education Partnership Awards. These awards are for K-12 education, and they increase, and we have increased participation of the institutes, which is now at 17. There are also research with activities related to diversity reward, or diversity award, which is called the REWARD program. This is a combined R01 grant program, along with it is coupled to diversity efforts on the part of the investigator, and that NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, has already been announced, and we're accepting applications. And then there's this program, the Instrumentation Grant Program for Resource Limited Institutions. There are 14 institutes and offices that have signed on, and the link to the NOFO is shown here. In addition to these initiatives that are already in already have made more progress. We have two concepts that have been approved by the NIGMS Council, the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. One is on institutional climate assessment and DEI action plan development grants. And the second is research capacity building program to enhance workforce coverage. And and finally, the NIMHD has approved a concept that will be developed, which is on institutional research capacity building needs assessment and action plan development grants. So there's a lot going on in the context of the UNITE initiative. Now, the Instrumentation Grant Program for Resource Limited Institutions supports acquisition of instruments, modern scientific instruments, by resource limited institutions. And the goals are twofold. One is to provide instruments for research and teaching, and to enhance biomedical research capacity at resource limited institutions. The eligibility for the institution, because remember, it's the institution that submits the application. These must be domestic institutions that are located in the US or its territories. By resource limited, our definition is that the institution must have received less than $6 million per year in research project grants. So research project grants would be things like R01s or R15s or R16s or R35s. And in each of the preceding 3 fiscal years, and they must award BS or BA or graduate degrees in the biomedical sciences. In addition, these institutions must enroll at least 35% of the undergraduate students who are supported by Pell Grants, or belong to the category of either historically Black colleges and universities or tribal colleges and universities. Instrument types that are supported by this program are very broad. This is an NIH, a trans NIH or NIH-wide program, which means that the instruments that are supported could theoretically support research that is supported by any of the participating institutes. So this is just a limited list. We can't provide an exhaustive one, but it would be anything from centrifuges to cell sorters to microtomes, circular dichroism instruments, fluorometers, FPLCs, HPLCs. It's a very broad range of instrumentation. And in terms of the budget, these are 1-year grants, and the award amounts range from $25,000 to $250,000. However, if you decide to purchase, or if you're going to purchase an instrument that costs more than $250,000, you can apply for the budget cap of $250,000, but you have to document where the remaining funding will come from. We also encourage the inclusion of service contracts in the award, and you can include service contracts for up to 5 years. And additional guidance is to try to be fiscally responsible and, when possible, secure academic discounts. Okay, so the next part of our talk is going to be presented by Anthony DeBello, and he's going to talk about the RLI S10 roles, responsibilities, and instrument uses.
Thank you, Dr. Beckett. Yeah, so I'll be trying to provide an overview of, yes, instrument uses and some of the responsibilities of individuals that are involved, both as users and in managing the instruments. And next slide, please. So the S10 considers 2 major categories of use, research and education. A typical research use case might be members of an academic research laboratory or a scientific research department using the instruments to collect data and carry out experiments for their research projects. A typical education use case could be the utilization of the instrument in a laboratory-based science course, such as an upper-level molecular biology course or biochemistry course or so on. Next slide, please. So each S10 application requires at least 3 major users, and major users are either researchers that need to use the instrument to carry out scientific research, or instructors of upper level undergraduate or graduate laboratory courses that will utilize the instrument in their teaching. In terms of the S10 application, a single defined research or educational project can account for 1 major user. It's also important to note that program directors or professional investigators, abbreviated PDPI, as well as other major users on the S10, are not required to have existing NIH funding. Next slide, please. Major users of the instrument can come from the applicant institution, as well as from nearby or regional institutions. And they can be located throughout those institutions, and they need not be from a single lab or a single department or a single school within the institution. However, certain individuals and aspects of the instrument plan are required to be tied to the applicant institution. And in particular, the PDPI must have a full-time appointment at the applicant institution, and the instrument must be housed at the applicant institution. And lastly, the instrument, use of the instrument for educational purposes in the instruction of a course is limited to the applicant institution. Next slide, please. So in addition to major users, other users or minor users, as we'll call them, are those that will also benefit from the instrument, albeit perhaps less frequently. Similar to major users, minor user use cases can include both research and education purposes. And again, similar to before, minor users can be from the applicant institution or from the nearby regional institutions. And one thing to note is that while no specific number of minor users is required for the application, application reviewers will consider the number of minor users and other potential future users that may benefit from the instrument in the evaluation of their application. Next slide. As mentioned before, the instrument should be housed at the applicant institution. The location of the instrument should facilitate the sharing of the instrument by various users. It should promote cost effectiveness, and it should facilitate collaborations and exchange between disciplines. And some examples of suitable spaces for the instrument are core facilities, shared resource spaces, accessible laboratories, and laboratory teaching spaces. Next slide, please. This slide and the next one will address instrument management. The primary manager of the instrument is the PDPI. The PDPI should, again, be facilitated with the applicant institution, and the PDPI's responsibilities include providing administrative and scientific oversight of the instrument, ensuring that the instrument is stored in a location that is safe and accessible, and PDPIs are also responsible for evaluation and reporting exercises, as well as for communications with NIH and instrument vendors. Lastly, the PDPI is the primary individual responsible for the S10 organizational plan. Next slide, please. Specified individuals with technical expertise are also key to instrument management. It's important to note that in this, with these individuals, they're not required to be, for instance, like full-time core facility managers. They can be, I mean, they certainly can be such a person, but they can also be instrument users, the PDPI themselves, or any other individual that has the required expertise and the ability to carry out the following responsibilities that I'm about to mention. These responsibilities include setting up, running, and providing training on the instrument, especially providing training for new users, ensuring the safe operation of the instrument, and ensuring that the instrument maintenance is carried out. They are also responsible for providing technical support regarding sample preparation, experimental design, data collection, data management, and data analysis. Next slide, please. The institution itself also has an important role to play. Institutions house the instrument in an accessible location. They support instrument maintenance. They provide support for the personnel crucial to the management of the instrument. They sustain the necessary infrastructure and facilities, and in general, they ensure the successful implementation of the instrument. Okay, that actually wraps up what I was going to present. I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Dorothy Beckett, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, so in the next section, I realize that some of you may have submitted applications before, but some may not to the NIH. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what we now call a Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO. And so all NOFOs have essentially the same structure. They have one part, very short part, but extremely important, which provides overview information. And one of the most important pieces of information in there are the key dates. So how many applications are accepted, for example, in each fiscal year, and what are the due dates or the deadlines for the submissions, and then also when can you expect to have the funding start. So read that section very carefully. Part 2 is the kind of meat of the application, and it contains 8 sections. I'm going to go through these and try to point out to you the ones that are most important to pay attention to. So section 1, this is the description, and in the description, the authors of the NOFO will outline what information about the goals of the funding opportunity. So what do they hope to, what do the authors hope to accomplish through this funding opportunity, and the expectations of the applications and applicants. The second is the award information. So this is also very important to read, because some programs will only accept, for example, new applications. They will not accept resubmissions, and they will not accept renewals. For example, this is the S10. You would not have a renewal because it's a 1-year award. It'll tell you whether it supports clinical trials, and then also restrictions on budgets and the project period. For example, this is a 1-year project period for the S10. The eligibility is also very critical to read very carefully. There's general eligibility information, but then there's going to be specific eligibility for a particular funding opportunity. And I introduced those at the beginning of the talk for the RLI S10. And so what you want to ask is the institution eligible and is the investigator eligible? This is really the core of your application, which is going to be the submission information. And this provides detailed instructions about the expected elements of a successful application. And it instructs and in section 5, there are instructions to the reviewers on how to evaluate the application. And when we design a NOFO, we typically design it so that there is a direct correspondence between the expectations of a successful application and the criteria that the reviewers are going to use when they review your application. And finally, and in the final 3 sections, this is important, particularly if you want to talk about this RLI S10, is that it's going to provide information relevant to the award process, how the award is administered, and equally important, we may request reporting about the use. In this case, we will request reporting on the use of the instrument. This is very important at all stages, section 7, agency contacts at all stages of preparing your application. So before you prepare your application, you may want to contact a program officer at the NIH for information about whether your application is suitable for the program. While it's in the course of being reviewed, you may contact the review staff or they may contact you. And finally, once it's reviewed, you may go back to program to discuss the outcome of the review process. And finally, in section 8, there's general NIH policy information. So now that I've given an overview of a NOFO, Dr. Lee is going to provide tips for preparing your successful RLI S10 application.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm going to talk about how to prepare a well-structured S10 application package so that it will allow your reviewers better appreciate the strength of your application. Next slide, please. For the institutions who are new to NIH grant process, the following registrations must be completed before you submit your application to NIH. These required registrations are unique entity identifier or UEI, system for award management or SAM, grants.gov, and ERA Commons. An institution for ERA Commons, an institution need to create an ERA Commons account for the signing officer first before an individual investigator can have the PI role on the ERA Commons. Next slide, please. So here we have the picture on the right. This is a form SF 424 R&R, and this form must be used for S10 application. There are 2 important elements on this form, this cover form. The first one is item 11, which is here. And this is the item for the title. The title need to be short, descriptive, and should contain the generic name of the instrument requested. And the second item, which actually on the second page that you cannot see on this picture, is item 15. And there, the title is Estimated Project Funding. In there, there are 4 items listed on the slides on the left. The first item is the total federal funds requested. If the cost of the instrument is $250,000 or less, just place the number here. If the cost is greater than $250,000, then you enter $250,000 here. The next one is the total non-federal funds. Again, if the cost is 250,000 or less, then you just put a 0 here. And if the cost is greater than 250,000, then you place the difference between the instrument cost and the 250,000. And also remember that you need to explain how this difference, price difference, will be paid for in the equipment section, which I will explain later. The next item is the total federal and non-federal funds. And here you just put the total cost of the instrument. That was the number come from the quote. And the last one is the program income. Here, just enter 0 here. Next slide, please. Here we're talking about the project summary. I want to emphasize that the first impression is quite important, and the project summary here is the place that for you to establish a good first impression. You need to write a succinct description of the instrument requested, and you also need to spell out the critical need for the instrument and what impact that the instrument is going to bring about to your to support your research as well as your educational need. You need to also explain how access to this instrument will stimulate biomedical research or support your educational need, and also increase the research capacity at your institution. The project narrative, this is just a short paragraph, typically it's 2 to 3 sentences to explain the relevance of this instrument to your research and how the research related to public health, as well as the impact on your institutional research as well as for education improvement. Bibliography and the references. Here you only list the publications that are either relevant to your team or yourself's expertise, technical expertise, as well as expertise in terms of operation and the usage of the instrument. All those projects that are relevant to the instrument. Next slides, please. And here I'm talking about the importance of the biographical sketches, or also called bio sketches. You will need to use these 3 sessions in this form to describe, or actually to highlight your technical expertise as well as your experience related to the instrument use or management of the instrument or similar experience, as well as your, if the project is more on the teaching and educational purpose, and also here you put your experience in training, mentoring, and teaching experience. And addition to the PI, major users are also other users or minor users, as well as some technical personnel, if necessary, can also provide bio sketch. And just remember that each bio sketch may not exceed 5 pages, and the science CV or scientific expert network curriculum vitae is a tool that you can use to generate a standardized bio sketch. Next slide. And this session is called equipment. And this need to be a single PDF as attachment. And here you need to specify the requested instrument, its manufacturer, the model number, and the specific features, and also the needed accessories. You also need to provide a detailed budget breakdown of this main instrument and also the requested accessories, and this including the educational discount tax, if it's a foreign manufactured instrument, the import duty. And remember, we also talked about it earlier, that if instrument costs more than 250,000, then here you need to describe the total non-federal funds, that is the extra funds that your institution provide toward purchasing the instrument. And most importantly, that you must include the itemized quote from the vendor with a proper discount, accessories, training services, warranties, so on and so forth. And also importantly, that we encourage you to include a service contract that are up to 5 years. And please note, if applications do not provide a itemized quote, the application will be withdrawn from review. So please notice this. Next slide, please. Instrumentation plan. This is a main section of this application, and it must be provided as an attachment with the name titled instrumentation plan. Here you have 3 subsessions in this attachment. The first one is plan for research and education capacity building. And this should have the following what we call sub-sessions. The first one is the overall benefit. And here you outline the overall benefit of the instrument to the institutional research and or educational capacity building, and also institutions' long-term research goals. In the research and or educational project, here you describe at least 3 major uses of specific research or courses. Those are the upper level undergraduate or graduate courses. So the next is the other users. Here you describe how the instrument will also benefit the other users or minor users. Inventory of a similar instrument. Here you just need to list the similar instrument that exists at your institution and explain why they do not, those instruments do not satisfy the research or educational need, and basically why you need to apply for additional instrument here. For technical expertise, here you need to use this session to reflect what you have in the bio sketch. Basically outline the PI and the team's relevant technical expertise for the proposed instrument. Organizational plan, here you describe day-to-day operation, management, and the maintenance of the instrument, and including how new users will be engaged and trained, and explain your plan for managing the instrument, and also in situations how you manage the project that involve the human subject, vertebrate animals, or biohazards. Next slide, please. Another attachment here is the letters of support. These letters need to come from the authorized organizational representative or business officials. The purpose of these letters is to state that the institution meets the eligibility criteria that Dorothy mentioned earlier, and also to indicate that the institutional commitment to the instruments of housing and accessibility and maintenance, and also institutional support for personnel. In other situations, you may need to have additional letters when applicable, such as in situations that additional funds is needed toward the purchase the instrument, then you need to have a letter to indicate that. And in situations that animals or infectious materials are related to the project, then your institutional biosafety officer need to provide a letter to describe the containment plans and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Page limitations. All the typical form SF 424 application guidance that need to be followed. In addition, the plan for research and educational capacity building, and this portion, the page limit is up to 4 pages. Technical expertise, only 1 page. Organizational plan, up to 2 pages. Altogether, this session should not exceed 7 pages. Next page, next slide, please. So here in this table, I want to summarize those sections that correlate to the review criteria. The review criteria, on the left side of the table, those criteria include overall benefit, justification of need, technical expertise, research and education project, administration, as well as institutional commitment. And the right side of the table contain those sections that are corresponding to those review criteria. As you can see that the overall benefit that should be spelled out, first in the project summary, as I mentioned earlier, and also need to be explained in further detail in the overall benefit subsections under the instrumentation plan. Similarly, justification of a need should be highlighted in the project summary, as well as in the session that education, research and education building under the instrumentation plan. Technical expertise that should be summarized, in the technical expertise subsections, and also indicated in the bio sketch, as well as biological, bibliography and references. And the research and education project that have specific places. Administration is designated in the organizational plan under the instrumentation plan. Institutional commitment, those need to be provided in the letters of support. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So NIH provided many resources that explains the overall grant process. An overview video is found in this link. NIGMS also published a grant writing webinar series for institution capacity building, and the link is provided here. The next link, notice of a funding opportunity or NO4, and here the link is provided to a annotated NO4. It's actually a PDF file with detailed explanation and content, pretty much as Dorsey showed earlier. And it's very important, especially for new people to understand the structure of the NO4. The next link is a official NIH application guide on how to apply for and how to submit an application. The CSR, or Center for Scientific Review, they also provide the information about the NIH peer review process. For additional questions, especially after this webinar, please email to Dr. Beckett. Here's the email address. And next, Desiree will acknowledge our team and lead to the Q&A session.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you to Drs. Beckett, DeBello, and Lee for the presentation. As I mentioned previously, this was a whole team effort to develop this Notice of Funding Opportunity announcement, and we're just presenting on behalf of the team. So we want to thank all the members of the team who are currently on the team, as well as those who were formerly on the team. So I just want to reiterate that a recording will be available along with a copy of the slides. And I will put the link is in the chat for where that will be updated. So next, I'm going to moderate the question and answer period with our three speakers. And thank you so much. A lot of great questions have come in, and I've kind of organized them a bit to group them together. So there are some that are similar. So please continue typing your questions in the chat, and we will get to those. Okay, so I will make sure that everybody is, oh, can we see everybody now?
Okay, so have we stopped the?
Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing. I'll stop sharing. Can't see everyone.
Okay, now I can see everyone.
Strange.
Okay, so I am going to start with one of the most common questions that came in 3 different ways was about multiple instruments. So I'll just ask each of the questions. They're very closely related. So one question is, can we apply for multiple instruments within the budget, functionality of which are codependent? The second question, is it possible to request more than one instrument in the proposal? And a third similar question was, is it allowed to propose 5 sets of the same portable instrument for education purpose, say they cost $5,000 per set?
Okay, do you want me to? I can address that
Sure.
question. So let's say you have related instruments. For example, I'm trying to think of something, an HPLC with actually an HPLC with a relatively modest mass spectrometer, where those are actually 2 pieces of instrumentation, but they're integrated for one purpose. That would be acceptable. Let's see, but a bunch of instruments to, for example, build a microbiology lab I am not certain of. So that would be something separate from this program. And what was the second question?
Whether like you could buy like 5 sets of the same thing for something for educational uses that cost like say $5,000 each.
That is not indicated in the NOFO. So no, I do not think that you could.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Okay, so the next common theme was about kind of the number of applications per PI or per institution. So how many proposals per institution can be submitted? Is there any limit?
Multiple applications can be submitted from a single institution, but they have to be for distinct instruments.
Okay. And can a single individual submit multiple applications for different instruments?
No.
Okay. So the a PI can only be a PI on one application.
On one of them, yeah.
Okay. And are you allowed to include reagents for the instruments?
No. I guess would you, for whoever asked that question, you can speak up and let me know what you mean by reagents.
Yeah, it was me, Dan Kahneman, Claflin University. Just thinking of say like an Illumina sequencer, right? Like, could I also include some library prep kits along with that request for the sequencer to keep the sequencer running, right? For courses or whatever, right?
I think that might be acceptable, actually. Yeah, if it's bundled with the instrument, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, let me get back to my question list. Okay, is shared BSL-3 facilities allowed to house the instrument?
That is so if this is an instrument that would be used in a BSL-3 facility, I would assume as long as you have the safety guarantees and it's accessible. So the question of BSL-3 is those are typically not accessible. So as long as the proposed users have access to that BSL-3 facility and you can demonstrate that in the application, it would be considered. But by definition, a BSL-3 facility has limited access.
And we have.
Can I add to that? Sorry,
You may. Yeah, sure.
asked by me. So in this case, like if you have 4 or 5 users who work in that particular BSL-3, can we submit the application for that?
As long as you can demonstrate that they have access to the facility.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we have a couple more questions. So there is a question about whether multiple PIs can submit a single application. And so this cannot be multiple PI, correct? Yeah, so it's a single PI, but multiple users are required, but they would not be the PI. And then there's another question, can a PI be a major or minor user for a separate application from the same institution?
Anthony, do you want to address that question, or Ning?
Well, I would say as far as I know, yes, but you might be better. I think the PI is the one where there's a limitation, but
Yes,
the user.
that's right.
I concur.
Okay, and there's a question of whether you can pay a core facility manager or trainer from the grant.
You cannot pay the core facility manager from the grant. The grant is for a piece of equipment or an instrument.
Okay. Thank you. And we had another question about whether both research and teaching goals are required.
No, it is or. So it can be totally devoted to research, or alternatively, it could be devoted to teaching, but you have to have 3 major users at least, and there must be minor users. So it can be totally devoted. I think it would be difficult for it to be totally devoted to teaching, but I could imagine a scenario where maybe a spectrophotometer could be used, have both major and minor users for courses, but it can be totally devoted to research. Yes.
Okay, and a related question, can a major user have both a research and educational program within the proposal?
Oh, that is a great question.
I don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer to that, but I think, there's no prohibition against it. So
But they would still count as one major
it
user.
would, well, is the course the major user? It's a question of,
Okay.
is the course the major user, or is the PI the major user? I would say the course is the major user. So, I mean, having gone to I attended a very small institution where courses and PIs used the same instrument. So if you define the user as a course, then yes, that is possible.
I agree. The language of the NOFO, from my reading, and in particular, I covered some of that in the section. And in fact, I kind of debated this in the language of my presentation. The language of the NOFO is that the course is the user.
Yeah.
And I actually, in the slides, added instructor of a course because I thought it somehow was clearer or somehow made more sense. But in some sense, it's actually, I should leave it as the course because it is the course. It's important.
It's the course that's the major user.
And the second part of that question was, what about an integrated clinical application with research and teaching? Is that allowed?
I would. So the question is that there's some overlap in the use, essentially. It's clinical research and clinical training, or clinical research training simultaneously. Is that right, Desiree?
I am not sure. So I guess.
Yeah, I can expand on that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Todd.
So Todd Kroll here. Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of a biomedical research project that has a clinical diagnostic application that actually could be an assay that's developed, a clinical assay developed out of that. So pairing research with a translational real clinical application, is that something desirable or maybe not for the application?
It's clinical trials are not allowed, but you are not referring to a clinical trial. You're referring to developing an assay that has clinical application. And given the breadth of the NOFO, I would say that is permissible. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. But isn't it like there can't be like a clinical use that is charged for, right? Isn't that not allowable?
But people do research in trying to develop clinical tests for markers, for example. I think that would be acceptable.
Okay. As long as we didn't charge for that assay, then on a clinical application, that would fit your description then?
Yeah, so it wouldn't be like it couldn't be, for example, in a clinical research laboratory where you're charging people for the clinical test.
Okay, I understand. Okay, thanks.
Well, the program clearly said that clinical trials not allowed.
Trials
not allowed. Whether you want to identify this as a clinical study, and that's also kind of if it's just a biomedical research rather than the clinical study, I think it'd be more appropriate for this program.
Yeah, if it's a biomedical research where, for example, you're trying to develop, it's really kind of a technology development of an assay, correct? Am I correct about that?
Yes, or specific probes for an established technology.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be acceptable, but I would like you to get, I would like to do some additional research on that, and you can get back in touch with me.
Okay, we'll
I
do
don't
that.
want to steer you incorrectly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, a couple of questions. One is, what's the difference between a minor user and an other user?
Oh, they're the same.
Same.
Okay, okay. Is there a minimum amount of minor or other users required?
No, but you should include some, because one of the goals of the program is to increase research capacity. So if you can attract new users to the instrument, that will that will be considered a good thing under this NOFO.
Okay, and then we have some questions about eligibility. Are medical schools eligible?
They must offer either undergraduate or graduate degrees in the biomedical sciences. So either bachelor's or, so that's the eligibility, either bachelor's, BAs or BSs in the biological sciences, or graduate degrees in the biosciences.
Yeah,
And
so,
by graduate degrees, we mean PhDs or master's degrees.
but then they must meet the other criteria as well of either 35% of Pell Grant recipients at the institution, so which is a bit challenging if there's no undergraduate degrees offered.
Right.
Or it could be an HBCU or tribal college or university. So you just have to meet all those criteria. And then there's another similar question who is an institution that does meet the Pell Grant number. And then they're curious whether a program that they have, which is a Bachelor of Applied Science and Applied Health Sciences, would qualify.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, and then look, I know there was a related question about, do kinesiology and exercise science departments meet the criteria for biomedical?
That is an excellent question, and I'm not certain. I will check and get back to you. And we're actually going to put some FAQs together. So given that this question is such a good one, we'll include it.
Okay, and yeah, so do follow up with Dr. Beckett in the coming days to make sure that that gets answered. Okay, well, there's a couple of questions about review. Will these be reviewed in special emphasis panels or in regular S10 study sections?
We are not yet certain. The review process will depend on the number of applications that come in for different types of instruments.
Okay.
So remember that I mean, this is freely available. S10s are reviewed by different. This is a, yeah, I can let, well.
Let me try to answer this question. All S10s are reviewed in specific emphasize panel. They're not chart of the study session.
Right. And that each study section focuses on different instrument types.
Okay. And then another question on review is for which criteria will reviewers give criterion scores?
For all of them. All of the ones that Dr. Lee discussed. There will be
right. So each application will receive an overall score plus 5 criterion scores.
Okay, we had thank you, a follow-up question about kind of departments program eligibility. whether radiologic sciences and respiratory care might be eligible.
Well, strictly speaking, if you're offering an bachelor's or graduate degrees, if the institution adheres to the criteria, then they can be considered. So if they're undergraduate BAs or BSs or graduate degrees offered in the biomedical sciences, then yes, the institution matches the other criteria, then yes. Mhm.
Okay. And another question about institutional eligibility. Can a partner institution be undergrad or grad degree granting and the applicant institution not?
No. It's
No.
those eligibility criteria are for the applicant institution.
Yeah, so it seems like that would be better served to be a partner, and the degree granting institution would need to be the applicant institution. Okay, does the PI have to have a minimum percentage effort?
No, it's not a matter of effort. These are going to be judged by the usage. So you have to have at least 3 major users and a very clear justification for the use of the instrument by those 3 major users, either in or more. Remember, it's a minimum of 3 major users. But it's not a matter of research time in this case. So it's not like an R01 or a research project grant. It's an instrument.
Okay, and there's a couple of questions about, specific instrument kind of combinations. And so I'll ask the questions, but anyone who's interested in applying, who has, specific questions about, your specific use and plan, I think it's a great idea to contact Dr. Beckett so you can kind of elaborate a little bit more, because some of these will be dependent upon additional details and things like that. But I'll go ahead and ask a couple of questions. So one is about including together a PCR machine, nanodrop, and gel picture machine for DNA gel electrophoresis as related instruments.
I can see how those would be easily bundled together. And what do you think, Anthony? I think based
the
on the
program
way
is,
the NOFO is written, no.
well, the program says that multiple instrument bundled together is not allowed.
Not allowed, yeah.
Right.
But it's reasonable to bundle those together, but in this case, multiple instruments bundled together are not allowed.
Okay, and then there's a question whether a GPU-based server could be considered an instrument.
Yes.
Okay, and then one great question that came in is that there's, they're noticing that there's some interpretation involved in some of these answers, and they're curious, who would decide if a proposal fits the guide or does not fit? Is it the program officer, the reviewers, the panel? At what stage would a proposal be disqualified? So any kind of elaboration on the review and decision process?
In this NOFO, there are very few points that would result in disqualification of an application. For example, if you did not include a quote, your application would be disqualified. If your application was incomplete in any other way, it would be disqualified. If, for example, the instrument, so for example, I guess, the multiple instruments bundle, there's a long list of exclusions in the NOFO. For example, and I suggest that again, this is another reason to read a NOFO very carefully. So in the description of this NOFO, for example, there's a long list of bullet points that indicate exactly which types of instruments would be excluded. So I think that, and it's pretty exhaustive. So, but if you have a question, if you're about whether something that you're considering to put into an application is fits the NOFO, you should contact me before you submit the application.
Okay, a couple other questions. So can multiple courses be considered multiple users?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. And then,
And they can be either major or minor users.
okay. Can a PI who's previously held an S10 apply for this?
Yes.
And must the PI be a US citizen?
That's not a criterion. The criterion, it's the institution that submits the application. So so as long as the institution adheres to the eligibility criteria, yeah. Lee, Dr. Lee, or I always call you Ning.
Yeah,
Add to that?
yes, yeah, feel free to call me Ning. Basically, if the grant is funded, the grant belongs to the institution, not to the PI. So with that consideration, as long as your institution agree you be a PI and that you're qualified to be a PI, then it's fine.
So a few more questions. Can there be more than 3 major users?
Yes.
Yes,
The more the merrier.
3 is the minimum.
And can the major and minor users be from a nearby non-HBCU institution?
Yep. But the instrument must be housed at the HBCU. And if it's being used in courses, it can only be used in courses at the HBCU.
Okay. And does a graduate course without a laboratory course qualify as an education major user? So perhaps a special topics course.
Well, they have to use it in the course. So if it's not a laboratory course, I don't know how it's going to be used in a graduate course. Can you elaborate on that? The person who posed the question?
Yes. It's a course, there's a 500 level graduate course where talking about using drug and ligand interactions. So basically a research project that the students would do as part of the course.
Oh, so they could actually, let's say you had an SPR instrument. They could measure drug ligand interactions on using the instrument from
Yes, that's why I said
yeah,
that.
then yes, it would be. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Sounds interesting.
And there's a question whether a minority serving institution is qualified. And so that's going to depend on whether it meets those specific criteria.
Yeah, so the OR is for HBCU and tribal colleges and universities. If you are an MSI, if the institution is an MSI and but is not an HBCU or a tribal college or university, as long as the institution adheres to the 35% Pell for the undergraduates and offers a bachelor's or graduate degrees in the biomedical sciences and receives less than $6 million in RPG funding from the NIH for the three previous years. So you would have to adhere to those criteria.
Yeah, so if Hispanic serving institutions meet those criteria, then they are eligible, but not as an OR.
Desiree, can I ask on that question about the it was a question back about the if the course was not listed as a laboratory course, but it did use the instrument for teaching, and they used the example of a ligand binding. I think, and I guess I want to ask Dorothy and Ning. I think it is the case. the key thing is not that the course is listed as a laboratory course, but that it uses the instrument for teaching, essentially. I think we use the word laboratory course to just describe what that often looks like, but I think it's that it's used for educational purposes, and
Right.
if the use is demonstrated, it's not that the university necessarily lists it as a laboratory course.
Yeah, for example, when you're writing up the description of the use, you essentially describe how the instrument is integrated into the learning goals of the course. So how's it going to be used in the course, and how is that integrated with the learning goals?
I agree. Categorically, high-level grade and graduate courses, graduate school courses are qualified for those.
Okay, and there's where did my chat box go? A question about the 35% of undergraduate student population. Is it the undergrads or all enrolled students at the institution? So that information is in the notice of funding opportunity announcement. So this is something, it's undergraduate students only. And so you can look this up in the IPEDS database, and there's a link to that within the funding opportunity. Let's see. I hope we've addressed everyone's questions. If anyone else, if we haven't addressed your question, or you have any other questions, feel free to unmute and ask.
Hi, hello. This is Jermaine. So I had a question about the limit. Do you think you'll have other, mechanisms for higher end instruments?
Ning, do you want to talk about
yes.
the high-end instruments?
Well, not for this specific resource limited institution, but NIH do have at least 3 different shared instrumentation programs, those including high-end and the typical shared instrumentation program and the basic instrument program. They cover different price range, mostly higher than this range, but that's typically is used for supporting NIH funded researchers. So it's not specifically for educational, but more on the shared research projects. I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Anna Dizak, and we have a couple faculty that are interested in submitting an application to this opportunity, but there are a couple that are interested in similar pieces of equipment, and then NOFO states that it must be for different types of equipment. How different is different, or is this something we need to email about with the specific types of, confocal microscopes they're considering and things like that?
Yeah, you should probably email and describe with a brief description of the instruments that you're considering applying.
Okay. Thank you.
And give some detail about those instruments.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yes, this is James Rashid at Morgan State University in Baltimore, and I was wondering whether it's possible to enhance an existing instrument with this funding mechanism.
Oh, I guess, what do you mean by enhance an existing instrument?
We would perhaps add accessories to an electron microscope, and that they've already purchased with funding. And I think the question there would become whether we can buy other pieces that will be added to it as modules to an existing.
You should probably contact me directly about that. So it is a commercially available module.
There would be, yes.
Mhm. How about if you give me send me an email and we can discuss that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Anything else? Any other questions that didn't get answered or anything that's come up in the last couple of minutes? All right, well, if not, we will close out. We really appreciate everyone attending today. Again, the webinar and was recorded, and the slides will also be available at the link shown in the chat. And Dr. Dorothy Beckett is available by email to answer specific questions. And we, strongly recommend that you reach out and share your idea before putting together a proposal to make sure that it meets the various criteria. So thank you very much. And, we look forward to seeing applications from many of you.